Experimental, cause and effect. This is one of the many important areas of how to do research where we're actually looking for a cause and effect. And in order to be able to look at a cause and effect, we have to be able to control the variables, and we have to do a good job of this in order to be able to have a good experiment. In the experimental, cause and effect, you modify the variables and you see the effect. You change the amount of calcium you put into the soil, you see the uptake of the calcium. You look at plant health, you look at how much growth you have on it. You change a certain fraction of a diet of an insect and you see how well it goes. You change the diet of an animal and you see how it affects other parasites that could be affecting that particular animal. You're looking at cause and effect. You're looking at modifying the variables and trying to see the effect that you get out of it. You clearly have identifiable, independent, and dependent variable, and this is the key. You have to know what your variables are. You have to be able to determine which one's the independent, which one's the dependent. Are they both independent? And by doing that, you can come up with a good experimental design. And then you modify it and you see how things work. When we look at experimental, it says it needs internal controls. Anytime you are doing an experiment to try and see what happens when you vary something, you must have controls that do not vary, where things are held constant. And by comparing against those things that are held constant, then you get a very distinctive result out of this. So in the experimental, you've got to be able to have your controls and make sure that you're changing things so that you can define things based on your control. The design and data collection allow for legitimate conclusions about cause and effect. If you don't have internal controls, you can't make a legitimate conclusion about cause and effect because you really don't know. So when you do this, you need to make sure that you've got proper controls in here. Control. Now, notice it says confounding variables. When we do controls, you have to keep some things constant. Some of these things are outside things that we don't really know whether or not they affect everything. And sometimes you'll find that they actually fall into competition with what we've got. But in doing it, you've got to be able to run your controls knowing that you're going to keep things constant in there. You must include control groups. Sometimes if you're looking at something like plant nutrition, you might have a way that some nutrients interact with each other. And in order to do that, you have to control the group. It's not just a single item, but sometimes you need to control the group. If you're looking at plant nutrition, you may want to go out there and only vary one particular material rather than a bunch of different materials. When we do this with people, it says we randomly assign people to groups. I've talked about that particular study that I found out about where this hospital is looking at multivitamins and chocolate supplements in order to figure out whether or not the chocolate supplement makes any difference in there. And what they do is they go out there, I think they were looking for something, a few thousand people, and then they would randomly assign the people to groups. And by randomly assigning them to groups, it takes out part of the experimental error, some of the bias that might occur if you placed people in distinctive groups. Sometimes you need to do pretests in order to be able to determine what might go on. And a pretest basically would go and use a much smaller group, and it would be on a much more limited scale. And sometimes you do that in order to be able to figure out where we need to do the actual research study. If you are looking at the amount of a chemical that it takes to control a specific weed, you shoot at the high end, the middle end, and the low end to find out where you need to actually set up your experiment. And this would be done through a pretest. So sometimes you need to look at pretests. You need to expose participants to all of the experimental conditions. So when you're doing this, you have to make sure that there are all conditions that are taken into account and that everybody is subjected to these different conditions. If you are running that medical study and you were looking at 3 different continents, basically what you're going to have is you're going to have 3 studies, one on each continent. And then you can go back and you can try and see whether or not the material varies from one place to another. So you must expose everybody to all experimental conditions. And then it says statistically control for confounding variables. If you've got variables that you may not look at, you've got to have that method where you can take them out statistically by making sure that those confounding variables are spread over each of the groups, and as they're spread over each of the groups, they no longer should give you any bad results out of them. Therefore, when we are looking at cause and effect type relationships, there are a lot of things that go into this. All we have to do is be careful about which variables we're looking at, make sure that we take out anything else that might be a challenge to that, and deal specifically with these particular variables.